Welcome to Hebrew Scriptures, Old Testament, number 27. I don't have the pleasant background I had before in Rome, and, well, that's a whole other story. When I was talking last time about poetry, and this time the question came concerning more the other kind of writing, the prose, I was also asked questions for some source material or books in particular that someone may find useful. One book, and you'll see a lot of what we've been talking about here, is based upon a quick introduction to the Old Testament, which is part of the Biblical and Theological series. The author is Tremper Longman III and Raymond B. Dillard. And you'll find that a lot of the stuff that I do has a lot to do with Longman. And this series is in part of Zone. I always mispronounce it. Let's see. Zondervan from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Now, besides that, in terms of what we've been talking about, there's an author by the name of Alter, first initial R, The Art of Biblical Narrative, put out by Basic Books. And there's also, Longman's article, A Critique of Two Recent Metrical Systems. That's when you were talking about the poetry. Now, he also put together with L. Ryken as editors a complete literary guide to the Bible. And that's, worth your time and effort if that is where your thing is. There's also a Rhodes, Rhoads, first initial D, and same first initial D with Michie, Mark Astori, the introduction to the narrative as gospel. And that came out by Fortress Press. And then there's L. Ryken, Ryken, How to Read the Bible as Literature, Zondervan in 1984, and Ryken with WHIL-HOIT, and Longman again, The Dictionary of Biblical Imagery, put out by InterVarsity in 1998. So that gives you, some place to start your work. Okay. Now, although the Old Testament contains a considerable amount of poetry, it's not most. It is written primarily in prose, which is kind of closer to normal conversational language than poetry. We don't talk except when we're romantic. We speak in poetry. Now, but even when we speak in prose, there's different styles in how we speak. Sometimes we're very matter of fact, like in science and math. Sometimes, our mood impacts upon what we're writing, especially when we're talking about politics. All that is taken into account, the same things taken into account in biblical literature. So the cola and the stanzas are the building blocks of poetry, whereas paragraphs and sentences are the building blocks of prose. And prose involves less of the use of the imagination, except in science fiction writing. So it's less literary than something that is poetic. And it's also not considered as high or as formal type of writing. But it's a great mistake to draw a sharp distinction between prose and poetry in the Bible. Now, most of the narrative of the Old Testament is literally shaped. Although the prose of the Old Testament resembles what we call stories of literature, and not surprisingly amenable to literary analysis, a literary analysis applies the categories and methods of contemporary literary theory to discover the conventions of Hebrew literature. Key word, contemporary. Things are constantly changing in literature. If you've taken a college course in literature, you know that. If you, I mean, if you took it, then if you take the same course 10 years later, there's so many new and different elements, and some things have been taken out, some things have been added. And the same thing is true when they study the biblical literature as literary. Points have changed over time. Alter writes, every culture, even every era in a particular culture, I'm going to stop there. Americans communicate one way, the French communicate another way, and the Russians still a third way. And in that communication, how George Washington communicated to how President Obama communicated, there's a world of difference, yet they're both presidents and they're both communicators. And the literary styles, the content, everything has changed. So when you're looking at a culture, you can't say there is an American culture. You can say there's a Southern culture, a Yankee culture. And you can't say the culture is based upon time periods, because, it is based upon time periods, because, every time period, the 50s and the 60s are different than the 90s and the thousands. So therefore we have to adapt that look. So every culture, and even every era in a particular culture, develops distinctive, continuing on Alter's work, and sometimes intricate codes for telling its stories, involving everything from a narrative point of view, procedures of description and characterization, the management of dialogue, to the ordering of time and the organization of plot. I wasn't feeling too well, left the TV on, and somehow I sat on the remote, and I woke up and there was a story entitled Murder She Baked. Well, I like mysteries, so I started watching it. I'm saying, am I watching a romance? It's and then I realized I was on the Hallmark channel, movies and romance, so they put them all together in one. Now, Hallmark has a different pattern of telling a story about crime than just went out of my Special Victims Unit, or that whole series. They each tell stories. You can recognize the pattern of the story. And the Special Victims Unit, or whatever that series is called, if you've watched it over time, you notice how based upon writers, the culture, and everything else, has changed the pattern in how they tell the stories. So, a literary approach explores and makes explicit the conventions of biblical literature in order to understand the message it intends to carry. We'll be talking about some rudiments of literary approach to Hebrew prose. Okay, genre. The concept of genre relates to both prose and poetry. Genre is of crucial importance since the reader's identification of a text's genre directs how he or she reads it. And that's, in other words, when you see something coming up, you kind of figure out how you're supposed to take this. The study of genre recognizes there are many different types of literature. Authors choose a vehicle through which to send a message to the reader. Just think, if you're going to talk to somebody, whatever it's about, you decide how you're going to communicate your thoughts to them in a way that you figure they will get the point you're trying to make. So the choice of genre is important because it gives the signals to the reader of how to take what's being written. For example, in modern literature, if you pick up a story and you read it, it goes, "Once upon a time," you immediately know that the author has deliberately sent you a message that, using this traditional formula, that this is not an actual historical event that they're writing about. It's a fairy tale. The Bible, however, is an ancient text, distanced from us not only by time but by culture. Genre is one of the conventions, as Alter we were talking about, is specific to culture. We must study each biblical book to discern its genre and implications for its interpretation. Now we're just talking about broad baselines. So what is a genre? A genre is a group of texts that bear one or more traits in common with each other. These texts may be similar in content and structure, phraseology, function, style, and or mood. Have you ever read something and it made you feel a certain way? You feel the passion of the writer or things like that. So even mood can impact upon how you're going to understand this text. When writers produce their text, they write in a literary context. They don't produce literary works that are totally new. Getting back to my Hallmark example, that you kind of basically know the outline of every Hallmark movie. You know the key elements of every romance novel. You know, there's always that point somewhere in the middle or towards the end when they break up or something happens bad. The same thing is true with Star Wars and Star Trek. They follow a pattern that you get comfortable with. We don't like to be uncomfortable with our literature. We find being uncomfortable with historical textbooks, especially math books, but we don't, we want to kind of have a feeling that they're talking to us in a way that we understand. So they don't start from something new. They use the conventions of the literature of their time and place. Now, we're not in the same time and place as the biblical writers, so the conventions are somewhat different. And so they write in a tradition which they indeed stretch, bend, but never break. For instance, biographies vary considerably from one author to another, but by definition they are similar in subject matter, a person's life. Short stories, different subject. What? You can always tell a short story, first of all, by its length. And story means it's fiction. When all is said and done, though it must be admitted that the genre category is kind of fluid. This fluidity is seen on two levels. In the first place, one text may belong to different genres on the same level of abstraction. A psalm like Psalm 20 may be categorized with either the kingship songs or hymns. The narrative in 1 Kings 22 or 2 Chronicles 18 is simultaneously a royal autobiography, a battle report, and a story about prophetic efficacy. In the second place, genres are fluid in that they exist at different levels of abstraction from the text. Since genres are defined by shared traits, there are different levels of genre, depending upon the number of similarities with other texts. A broad genre will include many different texts that share a few traits in common. A narrow genre will contain a few texts with many traits in common. Psalm 98 is a case in point. In the genre of Hebrew poetry, by virtue of its parallelism, we talked about, terseness, and imagery. On another level, it's in the narrower category of hymn because of its mood of unrestrained joy. On an even narrower level, it is a divine warrior hymn because it specifically extols God's power as Savior in a military situation. So, The significance of genre in interpretation. The study of genre has many important implications for interpretation. Nonetheless, two stand out as the most significant. Genre as a trigger to our reading strategy, and genre as a second literary context. Consciously or unconsciously, genre identification triggers expectations on our part as the reader. Indeed, it hits the whole reading strategy in motion. Okay, I'm going to give you a thing. I'm not telling you where it's from. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. Okay. For obvious reasons and various reasons, we recognize the lines as poetry. So we expect the uses of images and repetitions. Now another text. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, became king of Israel and Samaria, and he reigned 9 years. Immediate reaction, we're getting a historical narrative, and that's verified because it's 2 Kings 17. And we recognize that the author intends to communicate historical or chronological information. Okay. Here's something you might recognize. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. What is this going to be? Is this a historical event? And who's the speaker? Well, I'll let you know. The speaker is Jesus. He said, well, wait a minute. And then we know, and that's why you just don't take that line out of context, but you look at the whole thing. Right before it, it says, Jesus told this parable. So we know it's fictional. So we have an explicit genre signal that invokes a reading strategy significantly different than the one for reading a historical event. More specifically, it is didactic fiction. That is, it intends to impart a moral to the hearer or reader. A second major benefit of the study of genre is that it provides a secondary literary context. The purpose of criticism by genres is not so much to classify as to clarify traditions and affinities, thereby bringing out a large number of literary relationships that would not be noticed as long as there were no context established for them. In other words, the very practice of examining a collection of texts that are related by genre will result in illumination of each individual text. This result is particularly helpful for individual texts that are themselves difficult to understand, but they may be elucidated by comparing them with clearer examples of the same genre. For different reasons, then, it is important to discover the genre of a text by prompting a reading strategy and ruling out false expectations and standard of judgments of the text. Genre classification represents an entree to the meaning of the text. It's important, especially when authors are known for using sarcasm. The dynamics of narrative. Time prohibits an intensive or extensive discussion of the dynamics of biblical narrative. But this short introduction may be supplemented by some of the studies that I said to you. Now, the narrator and the point of view. A description role of the narrator in a story is closely related to the issue of point of view. The narrator plays a pivotal role in shaping the reaction of the reader to the passage he or she is reading. The narrator achieves this response in a variety of ways, from presenting and withholding information from the reader to explicit commentary. Narratives may be divided into first and third person types. In the former, the first person, the narrator, usually a character in the story, and as a result, presents a limited point of view, their point of view. Third person narrative refers to all the characters impersonally, and in this mode the narrator might display omniscience, all-knowing, and omnipresence, and he's in every place at all the time. So most narratives in the Bible are third-person omniscient narratives. And, okay, from Rhodes and Mitchell, which I mentioned before, describe the narrator's point of view in the Gospel of Mark. The narrator does not figure in the events of the story, speaks in the third person, is not bound by time or space in the telling of the story, is an implied, invisible presence in every scene, capable of being everywhere to recount the action, displays full knowledge, omniscience, by narrating the thought, the feelings, the sensory experiences of many characters. Often turns from the story to give direct asides to the reader, explaining a custom or translating a word or commenting on the story, and narrates the story from one overarching ideological point of view. I think of the rich man. The rich man goes away sad. And you have the whole description of the event. He knew his feelings. And then Jesus explains it all. This summary mentioned from Rhodes' book describes the bulk of biblical narrative. The voice of the narrator is often an authoritative guide in the story, providing the point of view. The narrator directs the reader in his or her, let's stop that, okay. Narrator directs the reader in his or her analysis and response to the events and characters of the story. It has been pointed out that readers react to a third-person, omniscient narrator with unconscious submissiveness. As the book noted, when the narrator is omniscient and invisible, readers tend to be unaware of the narrator's bias, values, and conceptual view of the world. The choice of such a powerfully persuasive literary device fits in with the Bible's concern to proclaim an authoritative message. Plot and character are closely related and may be separated only for the purposes of analysis. What is character but the determination of an incident? What is an incident? The illustration of character. Descriptions of the dynamics of plot differ in detail among literary critics. The first and simplest is Aristotle's. He describes a plot as having a beginning, a middle, and an end. Brooks defines plot in the following helpful way. Plot is the principle of the interconnectedness and intention which we cannot do without in moving through the discrete elements, incidents, episodes, actions of a narrative. Okay. As a general rule, plot is thrust forward in its resolution. Conflict is what generated our interest in the resolution. The beginning of the story with its introduction of conflict that pushes us through the middle toward the end when the conflict is resolved. As one studies Old Testament stories, a helpful first step is to do a simple plot analysis. This study provides the frame. Characters form the gist of the story. Some Bible readers will hesitate at this point. Should we treat David, Solomon, Ezra, Esther, Jonah, and even Jesus as characters? Such a move appears to equate biblical personages with King Arthur, Billy Budd, and Captain Ahab, and thus reduce them to fictional beings. To analyze David as a literary character in a text, however, is not to deny that he was a historical king, or that the events reported in the books of Samuel and Kings are accurate. We must admit, however, that we have a selective account of the life of David, and can agree that there is value in taking a close look at how the text portrays David and others. In other words, we must recognize that these accounts are shaped, that is, the Bible gives selective, emphasized, interpreted accounts of historical events. So, the prose narratives of the Old Testament are multifunctional. Most intend to impart historically accurate information while leading the reader to a deeper theological understanding of the nature of God and his relationship with his people. The stories, for the most part, are carefully crafted literary works. There are differences between, say, the Joseph narrative and Leviticus in terms of literary intent and sophistication. But in most places we can detect a self-consciousness not only in what is said, but also in how it is said. A literary analysis, or only a partial analysis, is helpful toward getting the author's meaning in a book, a passage of Scripture. Okay. That, I guess, covers today's intent. If you have any other questions, as you can see, I sometimes respond to them in mass ways. Or if you just have a short one, I can always put that into. So if you have any questions, send to jonathan.morse@va.gov, or you can see me at my office at in Perry Point, across from the chapel, or you can, if you are on or off campus, you can dial the operator and ask for me. I'm at Perry Point, and leave your questions on my phone. I'll be very happy to provide as many answers as I can, as long as we keep doing this show. So, I wish you all the best. I hope you're finding this information helpful. If you'd like other things to be looked at, please let me know as well. So may God bless you and keep you, and may your life be blessed through the study of the Word of God.